Welcome everybody for this week's seminar presented by Dr. Muhammad Ali from Queensland University of Technology. I actually came across Muhammad, I don't know if he'll remember this, when he was a PhD student at Melbourne University, and he was sort of winning ANZAM awards and all sorts of things for the research he was doing, and he's sort of since seen the light and moved up to Queensland, so that's excellent. He's published in a broad range of journals, Human Resource Management, International Journal of Human Resource Management, and of course the high quality Australian Journal of Management. Today he's going to be talking to us about a study he's done looking at gender equality and diversity. I should say great thanks to Muhammad. With the mask directions that came down, we sort of underdid about doing this completely online or in person, and Muhammad was keen to do it in person, which I very much appreciate because we are trying to get back to campus. For those of you who've booked in online, thanks very much. Chantel's sort of still working through the technology, so if there's any dramas, let us know. We'll let Muhammad speak, and then we'll have questions and answers after that. So over to you, Muhammad.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for attending this seminar. This is about a paper that has been accepted at the Journal of Management in Engineering. And the title of the paper is Insights into Ineffectiveness of Gender Equality and Diversity Initiatives in Project-Based Organizations. I picked this paper to present because this, I thought, is a nice sort of demonstration of mixed methods, and I think you'll find it interesting whether you are a quant researcher or a qual researcher. You can see the team here. The first two people, Marzina Baker and Erica French, are mainly qual researchers, and I'm the quant one on the team. So let's look at and start with, this slide also has my email address. So I'm not sure whether you can see the slides.
Oh, it's just, sorry. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, so it has my email address also for any clarification or in-depth feedback that we can't do at the end of the session, or for any collaboration opportunities. But I'll appreciate if you have any sort of comments or feedback on this project, so we can incorporate that in our future projects that we are also trying to do in project organizations. And why project organizations? If you look at one of the main reasons was that Marzina comes from project-based industries, construction in particular, has had 17 years of experience before she moved to academia. And Erica is also from the project management background, and I'm the HR person on that team. And we are trying to do some more exciting stuff in this area, and another paper is going to come out very soon in even a better journal than this one, but this is also a good journal. Okay, so let's start with the context. So the context of this project, so project-based organizations, in particular, we focused on engineering, construction, and property, as you can see here on the slide. They are very important industries for any economy. Not only for the GDP, from the GDP perspective, but also from the employment market perspective. All right, I'll continue, that's fine. And then also, there are skill shortages in these industries. I think most of you would already know that, including in Australia. And so perhaps they're missing out on the benefits of gender diversity, and that's the paper I think the professor was referring to, the AGM paper 2016 was my first AGM paper, but there's also another one that I will talk about very shortly. So, and we also know that in Australia, the Workplace Gender Equality Act 2012 requires organizations to report on their gender statistics and their gender-related HR policies and practices on a yearly basis for all the organizations from the private sector with 100+ employees. And organizations with 500+ employees, they even need to be more proactive, they need to have strategies or policies in place. So we're going to heavily relying on this, the database from this agency. It's called Workplace Gender Equality Agency, based in Sydney. So we use data from that agency, and we use it for other projects as well. So the context was these organizations or industries are highly important for any economy. There's a lack of gender equality. These organizations tend to be worse compared to other organizations, especially in management and leadership roles. And there are skill shortages, and they are perhaps missing out on the benefits of gender diversity as per my research and many other research outputs. So that was the context. So then what was the motivation there? So having understood the context, so the motivation was that perhaps the gender equality and diversity initiatives, and I'll be using this acronym GEDIs, that is what the agency also calls them, are perhaps a possible solution to address the issue of lack of women's representation. And the agency divides it, for your understanding, and I'm sure many of you would already know that, they have these two categories of policies and practices. One is called HR initiatives, and the other one is called work-life initiatives. So these two categories fall under GEDIs. So if that was the solution, so what does research tell us? Whether they worked or they didn't work, or whether they work now or they don't work. So as you can see here from on the slide here, so that was the other AGM paper, Baker et al. That's also where Marzina was the first author. And we looked at these project-based organizations. So I'm only sharing findings from PBOs now. The non-PBOs and across industries, including my AGM 2016 paper, the results were different. The results were better. That in other industries or across industries, these initiatives do work. But in PBOs, the research shows that they are not effective. And especially if we look at these here, work-life initiatives do, but HR initiatives do not work. They do not help improve women's representation in PBOs. And then also you can see the results, findings from other results, Gallia et al. 2015 and Hanapi et al. 2021, very recent paper, similar findings that these GEDIs don't work in PBOs. So that was the motivation behind this project was why? Why not? Why don't these initiatives, in particular the HR initiatives, work-life, from our research, we found that they are effective to some extent, but HR initiatives, so I'm talking about recruitment, selection, training and development, performance management, rewards management, and all of those rewards, these are all HR initiatives. Work-life is about flexible working arrangements and telecommuting and all the other childcare facilities or rebate, or all of that would fall under work-life initiatives. Interestingly, I was speaking to Erica yesterday, so they, I think along with Glenda Strong, they call these hard initiatives and soft initiatives. So HR, they call them hard initiatives, and work-life initiatives, the soft initiatives, they work, but the HR initiatives, for some reason in PBOs, they're not effective. All right, so then, so that was the motivation that let's find out why. Why don't these initiatives work? So possible reasons for us were, number one, types of initiatives. So for example, work-life initiatives work, HR don't. Or maybe also, if anyone is interested in collaborating for any future research project in PBOs, has interest in PBOs, this is where we can actually do another project, which is where we can look at further categories of HR initiatives and see which one within, let's say recruitment selection don't work, but perhaps training and development works. So that is the types of initiatives within HR, and maybe some are effective, some are not. That's also a future research sort of opportunity there. And the second one is selection and implementation of initiatives. So it's has to do with how those leaders select those GEDIs and how they implement those GEDIs or initiatives. So this was the focus of this study, which is where we said, look, let's look at the selection and implementation, and French and Strong's work have done some basic work there. All right, so based on that context and motivation, so these were the research questions for this project. So GEDIs, do they result in increased women's representation in PBOs? That was our first research question. So even though from past research we knew that they didn't work, but just to share with you, the reviewers asked us to add that. Initially, we had only the second and third proposition. We continued with what we already knew, and let's explore why. But given that this journal had a lot of quant emphasis, so they wanted to have some numbers and add this proposition. That's the inside story I'm telling you. And the second and third propositions were pure qual, that how are leaders' decisions in selection influenced by their understanding of justice. So we use the justice theory lens there. And the third one was about the implementation of GEDIs and how is that affected by the leaders' sort of understanding of, again, the justice and inattention, and we'll talk about that. So the second one was about selection. The third one is about the implementation. And then leaders' lack of understanding, I would rather say. So we'll discuss that. So let's move on. So our first proposition, that research in PBOs, so I've already shared with you that, so I'm not going to go over these again for the sake of time. So, but because there are a lot of those detailed results that I'm going to share with you, and you might find that interesting that a quant person standing here and sharing some qual findings with you, and I'm sure I think many people at Griffith perhaps will be more qual people. That's my assumption. Okay, and so proposition one was that the mere presence of GEDIs does not necessarily result in increased representation of women in PBOs. So the reviewers wanted us to show that they are actually not effective. So that was our first proposition, and that was drawn on the past research findings, which actually did suggest that these initiatives are not effective. Proposition two, and which is where we use the organizational justice theory as our main lens, but we also use some other perspectives and theories, and including inattention theory. But let's start with the organizational justice theory. And this is about, and as I think many of us already know about this theory or have used it in some research projects, it has more than 3 dimensions, but these are the 3 main dimensions of justice: distributive, procedural, and interactional. So distributive justice is about how, let's say, for example, if you're talking about the rewards in an organization, so how the rewards are distributed. In this case, when you're using the lens of gender, or men versus women. So who is rewarded? Procedural. And then it is what is the process, the procedure? Is it fair? Is it transparent? Is it non-discriminatory? So that is the procedural justice. And then interactional justice is about the respect and dignity that people will experience while seeking those rewards. So 3 sort of main sort of types of justice or elements of justice, and we, in this proposition, we use, we'll discuss that, but basically what we said is that if the leaders have this comprehensive perspective of justice, the GEDIs will be effective. But if their perspective on justice is limited, if it's only procedural, if it's only interactional, or if it's only distributive, then these initiatives may not be effective. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail when I'll share the interview data with you. And gender blind HR practices, that was another lens that we use. And that was Conrad. I've published paper with Alison Conrad from the Ivy Business School from Canada. Our recent paper in HRM, which is where we also collaborated. So we're working on multiple projects. So her seminal paper, 1995, which I heavily drew upon for my PhD, coined these terms, not these, they called it identity conscious HR structures. That was an interesting term to use, HR structures, and identity blind versus identity conscious HR structures. And they looked at women and other minorities and found that identity conscious structures are effective, identity blind or not. And my 2016 AJM paper was also about which sort of types of structures or practices are important. And I coined the term gender-focused HR practices. So you can call them gender-focused or gender-conscious or gender-based or identity-conscious, but they're pretty much the same. And gender-blind means, on the other side, means that gender is not even a lens that you use in your HR implementation and practices. So gender is not these are gender blind HR practices. So similar practices, recruitment, selection, training, and development, succession planning for everyone, regardless of their gender. And then gender focused or gender conscious, gender based would mean that there's a gender lens. So you would calculate turnover rates whenever you do that, or the system generates it, has to be doing for both men versus women. If there are promotions, men versus women. If there are recruitment or hiring or selection or anything, men versus women, you look at the numbers. In Australia, gender is, as we know, is the main focus of our equal opportunity laws for private sector. In the US, it's different. Race is their main focus, but gender is also important there. So that was the second lens we used for this paper, and we argued that gender conscious or gender focused practices will be more effective. And if the leaders have gender blind perspective, it's not going to be effective. And that part of the reason that may explain why these initiatives are not effective in PBOs. And then perspectives. These are the three sets of perspectives we also looked at. So discrimination and fairness perspective of diversity management. This is the same as gender blind or similar as gender blind, that you try to achieve diversity, but through not being discriminatory against any categories. But your practices are just gender blind or an ethnic blind or age blind, but you just have focus on non-discrimination and you focus on fairness. So the second is access and legitimacy perspective of diversity management, and that is where you look at diversity for some benefits. So for example, access to a particular market segment, let's say the women's market segment, or aged people's market segment. So that's the access and legitimacy. And the third one is integration and learning perspective, which is where you try to, this is the best one as per the research, which is where you really embrace diversity for integration and learning purposes. So you encourage your staff to learn from each other's experiences, which come from those different demographic, classes or categories and their life experiences. And my HRMJ paper, 2019, it was about age diversity, and I tested the moderating effects of these three perspectives, and we found that integration and learning perspective was the most effective. So organizations benefited from age diversity, the ones who had this integration and learning perspective. So these three sets of perspectives, and then inattention theory is what we also used for our propositions, because this is how it can explain some of those ineffectiveness of those initiatives, is that leaders are caught up with all their other quote unquote more strategic things, and financial performance and auditing and long-term strategy formulation and everything else, that they seem to pay less attention to gender and equality issues in their organizations. And so they have blind spots based on their past experience. They're unaware of what are the systemic disadvantages that women might be facing in these organizations because of their inattention, and they fail to notice obvious things. So that's the inattention perspective we use. So this is where then we presented our proposition 2. That based on these lenses, we propose that the decisions of leaders in PBOs are influenced by the complexity of what is justice. So leaders miss out on those comprehensive sort of perspective on justice, and the various arguments regarding its achievement. And it may result in confusion, leading to inattention and limited approach to the selection of initiatives. So let's move on to the next one, proposition 3. So proposition 3 is about implementation. And although it also drew on the same justice theory and inattention, but we also use a framework from the WGEA, Workplace Gender Equality Agency. So this is the framework which is where they can they categorize organizations, or in fact they encourage organizations to do their own assessment and see where they stand when it comes to their gender equality roadmap, from avoiding to all the way to sustainable. So avoiding is gender blind, which we have already spoken about. Compliant is that it's more than avoiding, but you're only doing what is legally required. And we all know that there's a a phrase that I really like is that laws set minimum standards. I read it somewhere and I always remembered it. So the compliance, the legal requirements are usually the minimum one. And then programmatic is the next stage of your of the roadmap, which is where you only do these or introduce those initiatives as an ad hoc. So it's not the programmatic in the whole organization. So if you have issues at the leadership level, you bring in a program. Once that's addressed, it's over, it's finished. So programmatic is more ad hoc approach, but better than compliant. And then the next one is strategic, where you try to be more strategic in your approach, and you recognize that diversity will bring some long-term benefits, and it will help you to achieve your strategy and strategic goals. Integrated is where this your gender equality approach is integrated in the system, which is where that it's part of everything that you're doing, from recruitment to all the way to let's say retention. So it's part of your all system. It's integrated within the organization. And then sustainable is the next and the best stage, which is where your approach is more sustainable in the long run, because it is designed in a way that it is not only integrated, but it is part of your culture and norms in your organization. So most people, if not everyone, appreciate diversity, and it is where it should be the most effective one. So the proposition 3 here would be then that these leaders' inattention and limited perspective on justice would lead to implementation of GEDIs or your gender equality roadmap more towards the left side, avoiding and compliance. So that if leaders are showing some inattention or they have this limited perspective, it is more towards the avoiding and compliant. So this was our proposition, that most PBOs would fall under either avoiding or compliant, and that's part of the reason they are not effective. So this is the research framework. Again, being a quant person, I wanted to put this model in the paper. That's my sort of contribution. Not only this contribution, I had some other also, but this is where I wanted to see. This is how I like to see, the frameworks. So GEDIs will lead to higher women's representation, and that, but our proposition was that they do not. And then the explanation would be this moderating effect. And why they're not effective is because of those leaders' perspective on selection and implementation. So that was the first sort of front end of the paper. Now the methods, and then I'll share findings, and finally some sort of short contributions that we'll discuss. So methods, again, as I mentioned, I picked this paper out of my so far 29 papers. This was the only mixed methods paper that I thought, okay, that might interest more people. And in future, actually, I'm working, in fact, trying to be more qual in my research also, and try to use these mixed methods. I did find that qual is quite interesting. It can help answer the questions with why and how. Quant is important, but qual is, I think, interesting. So methods, predominantly it's a qualitative design, but we also had the 2 studies. So the first study was quant for first proposition. Study 2 was qual for the other 2 propositions. So we heavily relied on the archival data, which I'll share with you shortly, and a case study method for second and third proposition. Study 1, again, WGEA 2018-19 annual reports. And study 2, we use case study, which is where we had 5 case studies with multiple respondents in most cases. And so those were semi-structured interviews. And then we also use documents, website, and equality reports for study 2. Okay, so the sample for study 1. So I'm going to give you some more details on the sample for study 1. We had 4,841 mid to large size organizations, which are pretty much 100 plus, that submit their report to the agency on a yearly basis. So that was a lot of data that we looked at, and you will see that we did the coding for all those 4,841 organizations. So study 1, and out of those 4,000 plus organizations, we had 842 were PBOs, and almost 4,000 were non-PBOs in that sample. So we compared both sets of those organizations. Although we could just simply take PBOs and do some basic analysis to show that those GEDIs were not effective, but we thought maybe it's more interesting to see what's happening on the other side. So study 2, we had 5 organizations, so 5 case studies and 10 interviews. So 2 construction firms, 2 engineering firms, and 1 construction/property firm. That was our sample for study 2. And if we look at some details here for the documents that we analyzed for study 2. So I don't see that on the screen, but maybe perhaps you can see the full screen, right? There are 14 documents that we analyzed from all those different sources: website, annual report, okay, and all the other website, annual report, WGEA reports. And I think can you move that to the right top
Like
corner?
that.
Yeah, that's
Sorry about
if
that.
you can even move it a little bit further up, if that's possible or not.
I think that's as far
Okay,
as
that's
it's going to
fine.
let
So
me go.
this is fine now. So see here, website, annual reports, sustainability reports, and diversity policy statements from their website or any published report. So 14 documents in total from those 5 organizations. Okay, so again, the sample but this time now I'm going to give you some more details of the sample for study 1. So study 1, quantitative study. So we did the coding of all those 4,800 plus organizations, as you can see here from the sample. And the coding was done in a way that, if you can see on your screen here, those practices.
Sorry, the little red line.
The red line, no, maybe there's issues with that or something. Maybe, okay, so it's working now.
It's
Yeah,
hard
I
to see
turned it
them.
off and turned it on again. It seems to be working now. So now with CFU, the recruitment retention on the left side here, all those GEDIs. So the coding was done in a way that if they had, and coding legends are here at the end, if you can see that out of 4. So if an organization did not have a strategy or policy in place for recruitment, so it received a score of 0. If they had a policy or strategy, that was a 2 score. And if they had both a policy and strategy, that was a score of 4. So 4 and then 2 and 0. And for I think those who haven't used this data, WGEA looks at strategy as part of policy. I think, generally speaking, we think about strategy as more macro, but this is not HR strategy or organizational strategy. This is sort of like if you have a policy statement, and then you have some sort of action plans and how you're going to achieve that. So that's considered as a strategy there. So if you look at the mean scores for recruitment, so I'm going to only share one, discuss one. So recruitment, so the mean score was 2.60 out of 4 for PBOs. Non-PBOs, it was 2.6, the same. And for across industries, it's the same. But if you look at most others, they're different. And if you look at the total score out of all those GEDIs that they collect data on, 16.21 out of 36 for PBOs. And that, if you look at without any comparison, that's quite low. That possible maximum score is 36, but the actual mean score for all those 842 organizations was only 16.21. So it's even less than 50%. But if you look at now the comparison, non-PBOs even worse, 15 out of 36. And across industries also 15.22 out of 36. So this is what we can see is, relatively speaking, PBOs had more GEDIs in place. But if you look at their actual impact on those women's representation, if you look at female CEO ratio or percentage, it's only 14%, lower than non-PBOs and across industries. And all those key management personnel, I think in most cases, if not all, it seems like everything, they have lower than non-PBOs and across industries. So this is, I think, a more graphical representation of those numbers. See, the PBOs are on the left side, right? And if you look at the GEDIs, the first set of those bars, higher than non-PBOs and across industries. But everything else, that's the outcome of those GEDIs. It's worse. It's not as good as compared to non-PBOs and across industries. So that is, again, more sort of understanding of the sample. Now moving on to the second sample of those 10 organizations, sorry, 5 organizations, 5 case studies, 10 interviews, and we had data from multiple sources. So if we look at this sample, so see here GEDI for all of those. So we did the coding for these 5 organizations in a similar way with the same coding ratings. And we also looked at their key management personnel and all managers and all the statistics for these 5 particular organizations. If you look at them, there was 1 female CEO only out of 5. If you look at their key management personnel, quite a range there, with organization B having all female key management personnel, and C and D with all male. So quite a range there, and quite diverse, and a lot of variance there, even just in that small sample. So let's move on to, these are the interviewees' demographics. So 10 interviews, 5. So we had a nice balance of 5 female and 5 male interviewees. And if you look at their experiences, that was also a bit of a range there. Seems like they had more industry experience than the organizational, the company experience. But of course, they would have changed their organizations multiple times in that time frame. And I think if you look at the last one there, involved in HR initiatives, as per them, 50% said that they were involved in HR initiative selection, and 80% said that they were involved in HR initiatives implementation. So there was some overlap there. Okay, now I'm going to share the findings. Do we have enough time? 10 to 15
No,
minutes?
yeah, fine. Yep, we're doing well.
Yeah, okay, so I think we should be able to finish in 15 minutes. So findings. Now this is for proposition 1. So what we did was we didn't run regression, which we had done in other papers. And we said, okay, let's just look at the association, the correlation between those GEDIs and the women's representation at all those levels. The first row is where we have these GEDIs in PBOs. And then as you can see here, none of those correlations is statistically significant. So there was no correlation between their GEDIs, even though they had more GEDIs than non-PBOs and across industries, it did not help. So the relationship was not statistically significant. But if you look at non-PBOs and across industries, these ones are statistically significant, the last 4 at the bottom. So that is another interesting, I think, opportunity for someone to explore that what's happening in this regard, that correlation are significant and negatively related in non-PBOs and across industries. Whereas they are, and so our proposition was about this first row here, that these GEDIs don't help improve women's representation. So our proposition 1 was supported. Now continuing with the second proposition, these was all based on the interview data, whereas proposition 3, we use that case study approach. For proposition 2, all interviews, 10 interviews, and this was how the qualitative data were analyzed. That you can see the first order codes here on the left, and then there are second order themes, and then the aggregate dimensions. And why dimension, although there's only 1 listed here, the other dimension was implementation, which we're going to discuss that. So remember, interview data was used for both propositions 2 and 3, and that's why we say aggregate dimensions. So this was all about selection. The next one we'll discuss is about implementation. So if you look at these second column here, second order themes, so these were the 3 main themes that emerged out of that qualitative data, and the main lens was justice. So I'm going to now share with you some of those codes which can be seen as representative for each of those. So I'm going to skip the first one. Types of HR initiatives, we have already seen that objective data. So I'm going to share the perspective, the paradigm on diversity and purpose of these initiatives. So these were some of those quotes from interviewees when it comes to their diversity paradigm or their perspective on diversity. See, the first one is that gender is almost irrelevant. And who's saying that is a female interviewee from a construction firm, and we would love to have more women, but that's a pipeline issue. So their perception is that there are not many women out there with their required KSAs that they will need for these organizations. The second one is also interesting. We look at talent irrespective of where it comes from. And the third one is right person for that job description. And even in my surveys that I've done for many quant projects, and then how you provide that opportunity for managers to say something about the topic or the research. At the end, people say that if we only pick the best person or the right person for that job. So this is gender blind. So evidence of the gender blind perspective. If we move on to the next one. So see, we had this discrimination and fairness perspective, and then we had access and legitimacy and integration and learning. So these codes are evidence of these perspectives. So see the first one, not to discriminate in terms of any factors and all of that, but we don't discriminate. So this is basically the main perspective. It is fair, it is non-discriminatory, that's all we ensure. The second one is that what is that they can get out of it? So branding and our reputation, that's the access and legitimacy perspective. And the third one is integration and learning, which is where diverse thinking, and also it is diversity helps us engage our staff. So engaging and improving employee engagement. So these are the three sets of perspective, but that's only interview data that we are talking about for proposition 2, but most had the first one, discrimination and fairness. So summing that up for, okay, I think it's just a little bit more of those purpose of diversity initiative. That was our third theme. Remember the first one I skipped, the second one was paradigms, and third one is purpose of diversity initiatives. We asked them, I have these set of interview questions with me. We asked them about why do you introduce those GEDIs? And then one is that availability of candidates. So we want to make sure that we go big, when it comes to talent pool out there. So having diversity helps us to be to have a broader net of those for our hiring purposes. Some diverse views, environment within the team improves. So there are some positive things here that people said. It helps us attract people and retain them. And then talent is a limited resource. So that is why they try to make sure that they are trying to hire people from all those different demographics. And then engaging and improving our employee engagement. So that's where the purpose of diversity initiative. So summing it up, our second proposition, so what we mainly found here was that the selection is based on accuracy of procedure to ensure legal compliance. Fairness is judged as solely being about the process. So what we found was that the leader's perspective was narrow, perspective of justice. What they only cared about was the procedural justice. So the process has to be fair, transparent, non-discriminatory, but what the outcome, they don't really focus much on. And the interactional, they don't focus much on. It is the procedural justice. But if you look at the US example, when they look at the process is fair, but they also look at the statistics, who is hired. If 95% of the cases, ethnic majority people are hired, so then even though your system was fair, the outcome is not fair, right? Or here in Australia, if 95% of the time women are not hired, so then perhaps we don't really are benefiting from the fair system or the process. So leaders selective and limited perspective on justice. And the second one is their inattention, lack of understanding of fundamental issues. So leadership are indifferent and have inattention. That was the second proposition which was supported, that the selection of these initiatives lead to their ineffectiveness. Third proposition, implementation of GEDIs. So see here we again had three categories: first order codes, second order themes, and then we had aggregate dimension of implementation. So I'm going to again share some of the codes for those themes that we're looking at. But remember that's interview data, but we'll look at the case study approach very shortly, which is where we look at other data as well. Responsibilities and support. So we saw some positive comments there that in many organizations, leaders are being held accountable and responsible for their GEDIs. We can see that here KPI'd on women in management matrix. Leaders have a balanced scorecard, which is where the equality is part of that balanced scorecard. And in some cases, in fact, the leaders were personally involved and worked as an internal mentor and hands-on approach. So they were not only involved, but they were also, I think, practically doing things in the area of equality. So some of the challenges to implementation of those GEDIs, we need to act fast. So that is where sometimes there are issues with the time. And they think that finding the right female for that job might take longer. So sometimes they have pressure to fill a position ASAP, and which is where they compromise on their gender diversity. We don't have a large team, so again, an issue of resource this time. And then operating staff is overwhelming, and that takes all the attention away. That could have been on the equality issues. And when it came to measuring outcomes, again, most gender balanced teams are most engaged teams. So they are in some cases looking at outcomes, and they're finding that there are some positive outputs, more engagement, and then again, individual business unit KPIs are in place. So in some cases, they do the measurement. Okay, so finally with this third proposition where we use all that data from those 5 organizations. So we use this matrix from the WGEA website. So if you recall, I shared with you those stages of avoiding, compliant, and if I can go forward here, programmatic, strategic, and then integrated and sustainable. So going back to the first one here. And this is what the WGEA also encourages organizations to do, that they look at all the GEDIs or equality initiatives or approach, and then map them against those 6 categories. So while we can say one organization is at the avoiding, but they may have some areas where they're actually doing much more than avoiding, but some areas they may be at avoiding. So I think to be more specific and more refined, we looked at each of those areas of initiatives, and this was our assessment, but using their procedure, that they have their own website. When I said they means WGEA. So for example, if you look at stakeholder engagement, so whether the stakeholders are engaged in that process of gender equality programs, so we assessed that organization B was at the avoiding stage. Well, they did not really do anything in the stakeholder engagement when it comes to gender equality. So that is where the B would fall under. And then leadership accountability, again, B was at avoiding. So we did all that sort of assessment for each of those organizations. And finally, then you look at the scores at the end here. And what WGEA suggests is that we assign 0 point for avoiding. So for example, B had 3 points, but when you multiply it by 0, they all become 0. It's not counted, right? Yeah. Avoiding is not counted. Compliant gets 1 point. So if you look at compliant here, A had 3 score multiplied by 1, 3. B had 6 areas where they were at the stage of compliant, multiplied by 1, 6. And we can then move on to the next one. So programmatic gets 2 points. So anything that they do in that falls under programmatic approach. So if you look at C here, 3 areas where they are more programmatic, better than compliance and avoiding, multiplied by 2, 6 points. Right, and then next is sustainability or sustainable, that's 3 points, and then integrated 4 points, and sustainability or sustainable is 6 points. So for example, if you look at here, none of the organizations had none of those areas where they were sustainable. They're all zeros. Multiplied by 5, they're all zeros on sustainable, but there were some areas where they were integrated. As you can see here, organization E was doing much better, that they had 3 areas where they were more integrated, multiplied by 4, 12 points. So at the end, we get this score, and I did this calculation for this and slide for this presentation, which is where, if you look at organizational scores, total, for all those GEDIs areas, for all those avoiding to sustainable, organization A had a score of 17. 17, 6, 11, 11, and 25. Organization E was much better than anyone else. And then you would look at their So that's 17 and divided by 9 because there were 9 areas on the left side. So we picked 9 out of 12 from the WGEA website, which we thought were relevant to this project. And then their average score you can see here was 1.9, so 0.7, 1.2, 1.2, and 2.8. And because 1.9 would actually mean compliant. If you look at the score here, it's compliant is 1. So anything from 1 to 1.9 would be compliant. Anything from 0 to 0.9 will be avoiding. So see here, for all those 5, 1 avoiding, 3 compliant, and 1 programmatic. None at the stage of integration and sustainability, or sustainable. So if you look at average for all the 5 organizations, the score was 1.6. And then that was compliant. And that was our third proposition, that their implementation is at a compliance, if not avoiding, compliance stage. So that was all 3 propositions, so contributions. So we looked at justice theory, and I think one of the contributions was that it is the limited perspective on justice that leaders take is contributing to that ineffectiveness of initiatives. Secondly, inattention theory, which is where the leaders are indifferent and pay less attention or have inattention to those issues which are happening in the organization and for a lot of reasons. And that leads to this ineffectiveness of these GEDIs. And then also the gap was that why these initiatives don't work, we addressed that. And practical contribution could be that leadership or the leaders should look at more how they can perhaps move away from gender-blind HR practices to more gender-based HR practices, especially in Australia, where gender diversity is the most salient form of diversity for private organizations. And some references at the end, but I'll finish with this quote, which I thought sums up this whole project very well. And I have my email address again listed here for any feedback, detailed comments, collaboration that you might consider. So this is where.
Sounds fair enough. Thanks, Mohammed.
All right, thank you very much.